Hi, this is Daniel Grove of Daniel Grove Photo. In this video, you're going to learn all about the noise textures in Blender. I'll give a brief introduction to what noise is and how it works, what it's used for and why it's so amazing, and then we'll finish the video off with the best part, which is where I'll show you how to use the noise nodes to get several different looks for a variety of uses in Blender. Let's start with a basic introduction to noise in Blender. If you already understand what noise is, then you can skip this section. Use the chapter markers down below. Alright, let's start off with the very basics. Noise in Blender is generated mathematically, and it can be displayed in a few different ways. This is one-dimensional noise. As you shift the W factor, we're scanning through the noise pattern, and we get a random value between 0 and 1 in terms of brightness. In the noise texture node, the following settings, scale, detail, roughness, and distortion, will control the details of how the random noise is generated and what we see here as we sift through the W factor. Two-dimensional noise displays something that we're a little bit more used to. We can change the scale, the detail, and the roughness, as well as the distortion. When we switch to 3 dimensions, things get really interesting because now we can visualize the noise as displayed on the outer side of this cube, but if we shift the Z placement of the noise, we can see on the top plane, it's just evolving as a moving noise texture, but on the sides, we see the other cross-section of the noise going downwards or upwards. We can also move it in any direction because it is true 3-dimensional data in the form of a noise texture. Now when we switch to 4 dimensions, it's still being displayed as a 3-dimensional noise, which can be moved in position just like before, but now we have that W factor that we saw in the 1-dimensional, where you can actually evolve the noise in place and it will sift through time, at least that's how I think of it as the 4th dimension, and we can animate things like water, smoke, and other things. One of the most powerful things about procedural noise is that it never ends and it never truly repeats. As far as I know, it should be a truly random generated texture, which means size does not matter. The size of your model is irrelevant because it will never tile and repeat. And that's very powerful when creating large models or where you want very fine detail, because you can keep zooming in and in and in. And assuming your settings are set right, you'll never hit the end of the resolution because every new pixel is calculated mathematically. And lastly, before we go any further, I am aware that Blender can create other patterns using other noise nodes, such as the Voronoi. It's capable of doing all kinds of cool patterns, such as grids and other random cool things. But in this video, I'm going to focus on the Musgrave and the noise texture nodes because they create what I call noise textures as opposed to noise patterns. If you guys are interested in this, let me know and I'll make a part 2 that covers the patterns and how to use these things as well, because they're a lot of fun to play with. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of what noise textures are practically used for. I use them for all kinds of textures. Sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they're very in your face. Like I said earlier, it's amazing because the textures that are created never end, they never tile, they never repeat. There's no such thing as pixels or resolution. You can zoom in or zoom out as much as you want. And one of the best parts is you have complete control over the noise itself. You can download image textures offline for imperfections and scratches and bumps, but not only is there a resolution limit, but you can't truly control or tweak any of the stuff inside that image beyond brightness values and color values, which will only get you so far when you need to customize something. However, procedural noise textures are completely in your hands and under your control. You just need to know how to control them, and with a little creativity, you can get some really great results. Even when I'm using normal PBR image textures for stuff, I still like to use procedural noise to add imperfections and bumps and scratches, because even if the image texture repeats, which is sometimes okay, your scratches and imperfections will always be random wherever you look on the model. Procedural noises can also be used for displacement maps, and because they're mathematically calculated, there's no resolution or pixel issues like you run into when you use image textures for displacement. You can get all kinds of wacky, abstract, and unnatural looks with displacement maps using noise. You can also get some natural and realistic looking ones as well. And lastly, noise textures are often used in volume shaders to create clouds, mist, fog, particles, and all kinds of really cool looks. Again, it's up to your creativity and your knowledge of how well you know how to tweak and use these things in a practical way. And of course, how long you're okay with waiting for a good clean render. Now, let's get to the fun part of the video where I'll show you several different techniques to use noise texture nodes to create different looks for your models and textures. So if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to type Shift A, add mesh, plane. I'm going to press my period P on my numpad to center and zoom into it, and then numpad 7 to get a flat above view. I'm going to then use my roller wheel on my mouse to zoom in a little bit. You can also click and drag your magnifier over here to zoom in. And then I'm going to split this view roughly in half to get the shader on one side and the actual texture visible on the other side. Put your cursor right in the top right corner of your 3D viewport and it should turn into a crosshair. Click and drag over, and that is how you split your view. I'm going to change this editor from the 3D viewport to the shader editor. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more on my left side so I can fill my whole screen. And on my right side, with my mouse over the shader editor, I'm going to press N to get rid of that side panel if it is out, just to save some space. And with our plane over on the left selected, I'm going to click New in the shader editor to make a new material. This will create the basic material output and principled BSDF, which is all the basic shading stuff you need to make things start looking realistic, but we're actually not going to use that. We're going to cheat a little bit by inputting our noise textures directly into the surface input of this node. So there's not going to be any shading or lighting or anything like that, no shadows. We're just going to go straight for the look, just so we can see what the noise looks like. If you find something you like, you can use it later when you plug it into a BSDF shader, which is the thing we just deleted. Lastly, make sure in your 3D viewport that you're in the material preview view, which is right there. Now let's start with the first setup. Shift A, go to search and type in MUS, Musgrave texture. This is the most common noise texture for me that I personally use, just because it's easier to get a nice contrasty gritty look. Now I'm gonna plug the height noodle output into the surface input right here, and instantly we can see our Musgrave texture in real time. Now with a few quick changes, we can get this looking nice and gritty and dirty. Tune your detail all the way up, click and drag to the right, 15 right now is the max, and your dimension, drag it down from 2 down to a smaller decimal below 1. Dot 2, 3, and 4 are nice numbers. And instantly you get this really nice, crunchy, dirty look, which looks like a continental map of a planet. I have definitely used this before for continents, but that's another video for later. Your lacunarity, I don't often change, but it's kind of like the size of the secondary parts of the texture. If you go up too high, you get this really tiny, like fine-grained sandy look, which doesn't look very natural. And if you go too low, you just get some kind of big blobs that also kind of kills the detail. So I usually keep this around 2. Dimension is the one that I play with the most, as well as scale, obviously, to set the general size of what I'm going for, whether it's large or small. But for this video, I think I'm going to keep everything at the default scale of 5. Next tip is to simply invert this. Now I know it's not really much of a hack, but for some of you, you may have never tried this, and it gives a nice different look. So to invert this, Shift A, click on search, and type in ramp. Color ramp is what we want. Drop that right in the middle, and it should automatically connect itself into the chain of noodles we have here. And to quickly invert this, you're just gonna click on the down arrow and click flip color ramp, which replaces the white and the black. You can now drag the black down or the white up to play with this. So this gives you a lot more negative space, in this case that's white, and the dirt, which is black, is much smaller and spread out. If you drag your dimension all the way down, you get an almost even spread of this really fine grain dirt. That's pretty much on the pixel level in terms of sharpness. As you can see here, I am zooming in over and over, and finally I get to the limit of what appears to be the resolution. Although remember, this is not coming from a source of pixels, we still have infinite resolution, we just need to play with the settings. So in this case, because I'm zoomed in so much, if I click at the lacunarity and drag it to the right by holding Shift, which allows me to more fine tune it, I'm going up to close to 3. Look, we now are back to almost where we were before, right? This looks like it did before, but we're zoomed in like 1000%. Now I can zoom in even more. Actually, Blender won't let me zoom in anymore at this point, but there is still detail there to be observed. You just can't see it right now. So I know I went a little past what the technique was, but that's the gist of it. Remember, you can always invert things for an opposite and sometimes very different look. All right, technique number 3, Shift A, click search and type in noise texture. This is the other noise texture creating node. Let's plug in our factor output, which is just black and white data. Remember, from values of 0 up to 1, plug it into surface, and we get this very soft, blurry cloud. We can add some grit to that by using the color ramp. This is what I almost always have to do because the noise texture is very, I don't know, it just doesn't have that crunch to it. Even if we turn up the detail all the way up to 15 and turn up our roughness, I mean, I believe this is still giving me 0 to 1 values, but they're just so similar to each other. There's just not a lot of holes and dark places here. So I'm going to press Shift A and add that ramp that we used earlier, drag it right in the middle of that noodle. And now we drag the black point up to maybe dot 2 or dot 3. You can see that right there to fine tune it. And then click on your white point and drag that down to like dot 8 or dot 7. And now you've got some black points and some brighter white points. You're just increasing the contrast. We can go really crazy by putting these handles really close to each other, like that. This right here is a nice way to give some random detail, but not everywhere, right? It's spread out, it's sparse, it's not overbearing, and that's a really nice way to add some roughness patches to a lot of different types of models. All right, the next basic technique of noise creation, and again, these are all very basic. We'll get to some more advanced stuff later on and how to layer these and combine these together to get more advanced looks. But I'm just starting with the very basics for those of you out there that are new to noise nodes and procedural texturing because, well, you got to start somewhere, right? So the next tip is I'm going to keep the settings pretty much the same. I'm going to put this at 0.8 for the roughness just because I like even numbers and play with the distortion slider. This gets some really cool effects. Look at this. It's like warping and bending things in a weird, like, gravitational lensing / water refraction kind of way. You can just keep on going up and up and up into infinity to where you really can't even see. Well, there you go. If you add some more contrast, you can see it. It just looks wild, right? This could totally be the texture of a star, right? Of a sun just boiling, and maybe make it 4D and animate this W factor. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, it looks a little crazy right now because I'm not animating it in a very smooth way, but you get the point. There's some really cool natural possibilities here by just playing with the distortion amount. I've never turned it up this high, by the way. Let's go back to like 2. So we get a nice bendy, warpy look, almost like the famous Starry Night painting, right? If we make it a little bit more subtle, we can still get some nice variety while adding some kind of curve and almost paint strokey, like wind current kind of movement to our noise. Once you get a little bit too high, you get this weird like spherical bulging. I don't really care for that look. I like to keep it below like 0.5, where we still have bending, but it's not super obvious what's going on. Remember, we can always turn our roughness down to get less crunchy detail and more like the continents kind of thing like I was doing earlier. And you still have this large value, right? Without this color ramp, this is what it looks like. You almost can't see anything. So that means you do have a lot of control over these values. I mean, I can make like a map, right? I can make like a planetary map by doing this. I'm just using these values for continents. And I have control over the shape by using the distortion. Also, you can go to the negative range. Pretty cool. If you do things like this with lots of contrast, lots of roughness, and playing around with the distortion, you can get some pretty decent scratches on metal surfaces. And you could move your W factor as basically like a random seed to try different looks and randomize the whole texture. Again, I have this W factor because I have switched this to 4D noise, just in case you missed that earlier. Okay, let's take things to the next level. Let's combine 2 different noise textures in a single chain. How do we do that? Well, let's start with that Musgrave texture again. There we go. Plug it in right here. Let's turn our detail to 1, dimension to 0.4. Keep everything else the same. This is totally not interesting, not very useful. But wait, look what happens when we plug something into the vector. Now, normally we would put UV mapping or texture coordinates into the vector, but you can plug other stuff in there too, like another noise texture. So let's type in noise texture. And now suddenly we're getting 2 noises combined into each other, and there's lots of possibilities. Let's turn up our detail all the way up. Cool, we got that crunch. Now let's turn our roughness up. Wow, it's adding like more and more layers of that distortion. So when it's low, it's just bending those blobs into like warped, like, you know, kind of multi-ring versions of itself. But as we go higher and higher, it's just like subdividing that warp and getting really, really gritty. And that is really cool right there. We also have the scale of the first noise texture. If we set it to 10, it looks a lot more fine-tuned. If we go down to 1, much larger. So this looks like the Musgrave, but it's a little bit flatter, and it has a lot more grit and in-between stuff filling in these black spaces. Remember, we also have these controls, which we haven't really touched, like the scale of the Musgrave texture, very small, which is cool. Lots of negative space there, or very large. A really small scale Musgrave getting distorted by a pretty large scale noise texture. What if we flip-flop these? Put this at 21 and the other one at 1. A lot smoother looking. So as you can see, there's all kinds of combinations and really cool ways you can use these to get cool results. Okay, the next technique is we're going to flip-flop these. Instead of a noise texture into a Musgrave, we're going to put a Musgrave into a noise texture. So let's just unplug this, and flip them around. Plug the noise texture in there. Let's put the settings as scale at 10, detail at 15, roughness at 0, and distortion at 0. And then for the Musgrave, let's plug it into the vector. And let's put these settings at scale to 5, detail 15, dimension 0.75, and left and air to keep it at 2. Now we have almost a marble texture. And remember, because The real noise we're seeing is a noise texture node. Remember, it's kind of gray and flat, right? So let's add some contrast. Shift A, add a color ramp, drop it in the middle, and let's raise the black up to right there and the white down to about there. There we go. Now we see this beautiful ringed structure. Let's put the noise texture to 4D so we can kind of go through the W factors and randomize it and get new results. This is really interesting. This looks like a fractal, right? Without the orderly symmetry. But that is just like mesmerizing me right there. Wow, I'm about to fall asleep. This looks super trippy. Okay, let's get rid of the noise and the color ramp for this next technique. All right, let's delete those two nodes, plug in our Musgrave into the surface. Let me zoom in. If you're exploring around, you may have found that there are multiple modes for the Musgrave texture to be in. We've only been using the FBM mode, which is the most popular, but there's some other ones. Ridged multifractal is really cool. Again, it starts off as not very interesting, but let's put in some specific numbers here. Scale, keep it at 5, detail at 15, dimension at 0.2, lacunarity at 3, offset, keep it at 0, and the gain, this is where it gets fun, put it at 100. Boom, look at that. Isn't that beautiful? It looks like some kind of creepy organic vines or tentacles growing on the surface of a planet, and the gain does increase that. So if you bring our gain back down closer to 0, we lose a lot of that detail. And we have like more of an abstract, kind of a dreamy, weird energy thing going on here. But as you get back up to 100 and even beyond it, it gets really intense in detail. Let's zoom in a little bit, see what's going on here. So this seems to be making large curvy lines, which then themselves are subdivided with curves coming off at random angles. Some are small, some are big. Those big ones have their own curves coming off of them. And I'm pretty sure those curves have more curves coming off of them. As we go down in gain, we're seeing less and less of that subdivision level. So I'm going down, I'm in the 20s now. Wow, isn't that beautiful? It looks like something in nature, right? Very cool. So many cool uses of this that I have not even barely touched. All right, now let's take this to the next level and do that normals or vector trick to this Musgrave. So we're actually going to copy this on itself. So Shift D to copy that. You have to select it first to Shift D. And now plug in your height output to the vector. And now look at this. We get this crazy, like super gritty, almost, it looks like concrete to me, but it looks like something went wrong. Like some acid or something happened to the concrete. Let's bring this first one's gain down to 50. Oh, look at that. You can see some of those larger curves coming through. We can play with the dimension as well to add or take away detail. Wow, very cool. This looks like that marble texture we were seeing earlier. We've got lacunarity. This looks like now this is looking like a slice of something organic, right? Like a CT scan of some alien organism. We can switch this to 4D and this to 4D as well. And now we can use we can play with the W factor of either of these two noises, or we could even connect them. Make a value node right here, which is just simply a number value. Plug that into W, plug that into the W, and then plug this into the other W. So this number is both W's. And now they're just tripping out together. And wow, you got some really cool animated backgrounds. Here's a pro tip that I didn't plan on sharing, but here it is. In any number parameter that you'd like to automatically animate forever, click on it, type in $, frame, asterisk or multiplied, and now do a really small decimal like .001, hit enter. And now if you press play in your animation, every frame it gets to will now multiply by .001 and become the new value. So forever and ever, this will animate automatically. And the decimal controls the speed. If you add another 0, now it's animating very slowly, and that looks seriously cool. Look at that. I barely did anything, and we got this super crazy animation going on. If that doesn't excite you, I don't know what does. All right, let's delete these first two nodes that we made. Let's stay with the original ridged multifractal node here. Let's keep the settings how they are, and let's use a noise texture now to distort this one. So Shift A, type in noise texture, plug in your factor output into the vector. We get this psychedelic 70s looking thing, but let's play with the settings. Let's put our scale down to 1, detail at 15, roughness at .8. Now we get another very concrete-like texture that is kind of flat, but it still has a lot of detail, and there is some micro contrast in the very small pieces where they meet. You can control that, of course, by turning down your roughness here, or turning up your dimension on the Musgrave to make it softer and smoother. All right, now let's use two noise textures on each other. Shift D, plug in this factor into the vector, and that factor to the surface so we can see what's going on. For the second one, let's put our scale at 8, detail at 15, roughness at 0.5. For the first one, let's put a scale of 2, detail 15, roughness 0.7, and distortion at 0.4. Now, because we are of course using the noise textures, it's very flat and gray, so let's add some contrast by adding a ramp. Drag up the black point, drag down the white point. Then we get a nice soft thing with some distortion because we literally have the distortion turned up. It's giving some nice warpy effects and just kind of making things more irregular and not so perfect. You want to avoid patterns and imperfections and predictable things because that's what this type of noise texture is all about, is grit and dirt and randomization. Now, instead of using the factor output, which is a black and white value from 0 to 1, let's use the color output, which gives us kind of like a normals vector data thing, but it's still coming out as a black and white. That's totally okay. But the data is a little bit richer, and so it gives us a different look. I like this because it's not as distorted and wild as the last few like marbly texture ones are, but it's still kind of choppy and almost painterly. If we turn down the roughness, we lose some of that crunch, and this looks almost like watercolor. Very cool, very dreamy. Of course, we can turn down or up the distortion and get more of that warpy bendiness, depending on what you like and what you're going for. The roughness of the final node will also fill in the gaps, some more grain and detail. That looks really pretty to me. I like that. All right, so we're in the final part of the video where I'm going to show you some more advanced tricks to get even more out of these basic techniques. Look at the past few noise setups that we've done as basic Lego building blocks. The next things are going to be the icing on the cake to really make things much more unique and customizable. So we have only been working with black and white values so far, which is totally normal for roughness and metallic and bump. That's what you use. It's just black and white values. But for the color data of an object, which is what we see on the surface, it's really fun to add color. So let's keep this color ramp node there for the sake of contrast, but let's shift D and make another one. And this one is going to contain color data. And in fact, we can size up the color ramp much larger just to give us a little bit easier way to control the colors. So let's move our black all the way back here and our white all the way up here. Remember, the one over here on the left is giving us contrast and punch. This one is going to now give us a color scheme. So let's click on white and let's make it a light blue. Maybe a desaturated, like not a strong blue, but just like a whiter pale blue. Let's click the plus button, which should make one right in the middle. And let's give this a more saturated, maybe pink, purple, my favorite color. Plus again, let's do like a nice red. Plus again, let's do something like a bright yellow. Maybe not that saturated because it looks kind of bleh. Now what's happening here is we're converting the darker values, which is the left side of the gradient or the color ramp, to these colors on the left. So the blackest black is black. And then it turns into this weird baby poop dark yellow. Then we get this faint red into a purple. And now we're in the midtones. And then as we go to the right, the brighter parts of the noise, which is what we see as the light blue parts, it's going to be controlled over here on the right. Once you make a color scheme you like, you can shift through the color wheel by making another node called the hue saturation value. And here, all you have to do is just play with the hue slider. So it keeps the color scheme that you did, but it shifts it around the color wheel from 0 all the way up to 1, which makes a 360 turn on the color wheel. And that's just a fun way to experiment with new color possibilities that you may not have thought of yet. I like this, and it looks like plasma energy or something magical. All right, that's how to add color to your nodes. Let's go back to the black and white stuff. Let's say you need different values coming out of here. This is still 0 to 1. 1 being the white pixels, 0 being the black pixels. What if you need more than that? Going into a roughness or texture, or more likely, something like a volume or displacement node? Well, you can morph these numbers by using the mapping range. Shift A, click on search, and type in range. We get map range node. Here we go. And now we have 4 basic parameters: from minimum, from max, to minimum, to max. So on the bottom, these are the outputting values. So if I put to max as 10, that means the white pixels are now not a value of 1 coming out of the result, right? Out of this way. But the white pixels are now a value of 10. And the black pixels are still 0. And everything is now spread between 0 and 10 instead of 0 and 1. We can also do negative values if you need that for whatever reason. We can do the black pixels at negative 10. Now the positive values, or the bright values, are positive 10 all the way to the top of the ceiling. And everything is now between negative 10 and positive 10. These two top sliders, from minimum and from max, are kind of like a color gradient right here. Pretend like the black point is the from minimum, right? We can control the contrast coming in and the contrast going out with the from maximum here. So that's basically what this is going to do. If we click on this node, if we click on this color and press M for mute, now this node is not being used, but we can emulate the same look by basically controlling the minimum and maximum here. Now let's put these values back to 0 to 1. There we go. Now if I drag up from minimum up to maybe dot 3 or 4, right? That's what we did earlier, and then drag down the from max, which is like the white point, down to dot 6 or 7. We're basically getting the same look as we did with this guy over here, because we're doing the same thing. If you change this from linear to stepped linear, you get the option of how many steps you want. So now there's only 4 steps of value between black and white. If we go down to 2, it's basically posterizing. That's what it's called in Photoshop, where it takes all your values and limits them to a few numbers. So now there's black, gray, and white. If we go up to, say, 10, now there's 10 different values. It's almost like 8-bit video game, right? Not a lot of detail between the value changes. If we go up to 32, it's getting a lot smoother to where you can barely tell that anything's happening at all. 100, yeah, we have 100 different values, and so on and so forth. All right, let's get to one of my favorite techniques, which is using the Mix RGB node to combine node setups. So let's say we want to keep this as our base texture, and then we want to add another noise texture on top of it. And no, we're not going to be plugging stuff into vectors and doing more warping. We're going to layer things just like Photoshop. So Shift A, make a Musgrave. Here we go. Let's do those basic settings we did before with a high detail and a low dimension, like .4. Let's go to Add, Color, Mix Color, drop it right there, and plug in your height of the Musgrave to B. Now, with this factor crossfader, just like a DJ crossfader, we can fade between A, which is those noises that we had made earlier, and then B, which is just the Musgrave. If we put it in the middle, it's an even mix of both. You can't really tell because the Musgrave has more texture and it's kind of overpowering things, but it is 50-50 now. If we go farther to the left, we're getting more of a mix of these noise textures with a little bit of Musgrave on top, and now we're basically combining the best of both worlds. The nice washy, painty look of this with some gritty black spots of the Musgrave. But there's more. Turn the factor all the way up, and now switch to multiply. I call these blend modes because in Photoshop, that's what they're called. There's a whole bunch of them, and basically they're different mathematical ways to combine pixels of one source with another. In multiply, it's grabbing just the black pixels from 0 to 0.5, I should say the darker pixels, from Musgrave and layering them on top of these guys right here, but only the darker pixel. As you can see, nothing gets brighter, but it only gets darker based on the Musgrave texture. If we change the scale, we can see it's kind of chopping up and adding blackness to it. There's overlay, which does both. It adds the brighter and the darker pixels, and we'll kind of use the Musgrave to brighten and darken the noise textures. I use overlay when I want things to both get brighter in the bright spots and darker in the dark spots. All right, a third way to layer things using the Mix RGB is by using the Mix Factor, which is essentially a mask, a black and white mask like in Photoshop that will reveal or hide the B on top of the A. So we're going to make 3 different noise textures here. A is going to be the colored noise cloud from the noise texture. It's very faint, so I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. Instead of using the color ramp, which will take away the color, I'm just going to use the contrast node. Turn it up a little bit. There we go. Just so we can see what's going on. So the base texture is colored, right, from the noise texture right here, going into A. B is going to be Musgrave like this, and we're going to reveal B on top of A based on a third texture. I'm going to make another noise texture with a color ramp connected so that we can control the contrast of it. So we're plugging this into factor. So instead of being able to turn the factor from 0 to 1, like a DJ crossfader, now it's being controlled by whatever data is coming out of this guy, which is coming from this. So we've got a noise texture here. Let's turn up the detail, roughness, and now we can control where B, which is Musgrave, is being layered on top of A, which is this colorful thing, right? And it's all based on this map right here. So if we turn up our scale, it's basically cutting holes and showing Musgrave on top of the colors. If we make this mask, which is the middle one here, darker, we see more of B. In fact, right now I see all of B, which is Musgrave, right? Input B. But if we slide things to the right, this mask in the middle is getting brighter and brighter, and now we're seeing more of A. So bright points show A, dark points show B. Now this example I'm showing you is pretty abstract and ugly, but this technique is very powerful for showing certain, maybe a high level texture in certain areas on top of a low level texture. Great for realism and variety. Alright, next let's talk about UV mapping and coordinates for the vector input to be used in the right way, how it's supposed to be for a noise texture. So let's go back to that ridged multifractal because it's so cool. Detail all the way up, dimension at .4, linearity and offset leave them, and gain it 100. Boom. Very techno, but still kind of organic in a creepy way. HR Geiger would love this. Alright, so let's click on the Musgrave and let's press Control T. Now if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled in the add-on section, you'll get these two guys automatically created and plugged in the right way. The texture coordinates has a lot of options of where to get coordinates from. Generated is just, I guess it's just generated based on the global grid. We can use normal, which is the normal of the object, which doesn't look great. We can use UV, which is UV unwrapping. So even though this is procedural generated to infinity, we can UV unwrap this on a mesh in specific ways, which gives us total control over scale across the vertexes and faces. We can use the object origin. So now if we scale it, look, it's based on the center point. Isn't that trippy? Warp speed, very cool. And we can give coordinates from the camera. So if we move our camera, whoa, in 3D, the noise is cutting through like a CT scan through our flat plane. If we put this back to 2D, let's see what this does. Oh my gosh, that's weird. I'm changing my 3D view, but the noise is not. Kind of. Very weird. I don't know any practical application to that. Let's go back to 3D. And let's not use camera. Let's go to UV. I'm actually going to subdivide this. So in edit mode, I'm going to type in subdivide, and let's make a few subdivisions. There we go. Now I'm going to turn this panel into the UV editor, and you'll see what's going on here. This face is being UV unwrapped across this UV space. Now yes, this noise pattern is going to continue forever out here, and it will never repeat. See, if I select all the faces in the UV editor and scale them up with S, normally with an image texture, that image would start repeating and tiling and looking really ugly. But because this is procedural noise, it will never repeat itself, no matter how large we make it. But we have control over the UV unwrapping across the faces, so I can grab one face and scale it up or down. And because these are because these are separated from each other, we're getting this weird like window effect where like one point is bigger and one is smaller. Not something you'd normally do. But if I turn on proportional editing, now I can use my mouse wheel to proportionally scale up a section, and the others near it will react with that. Pretty weird. I more often use this on hard surface models where I want the noise or grit to be a certain scale in one area, and then I'll select a few other areas and make them a little bit different. And in that case, these points would not be next door neighbors to the other meshes. They will be completely separate pieces on the same model. So that's why I sometimes use UV unwrapping for a procedural noise. If you use the object coordinates, it will be based on the center point, and usually the scale appears to be a lot smaller. You usually have to turn your scale down when you use object orientation, but because it's all based on the center point of the mesh, you can do all kinds of cool and fun stuff. Okay, so one last tip is we can cross-fade between a good normal coordinates and a noise texture by using the mix node. And let's put this as vector mode. Let's drag that right there. Now we can get the noise texture, plug in the color right here. And now we are cross-heading between normal coordinates from the object origin. As we turn this up, the noise texture down here, the color, which is the normals map, can basically intrude upon those coordinates and just freak them the heck out. Look at that. It's just getting all kinds of gnarly. And based on the settings we use here, it'll change the shape of that distortion. Higher detail for a really nice, beautiful marble texture, or something smoother and more abstract like that. But I really like that gritty marble look right there. That's very cool. If we go all the way up, it's just really doing a lot of damage to it. And that looks like some stuff we got earlier, because that's what we did. We just plugged noise straight in here. But I like to mix a little bit of coordinates with a little bit of noise intrusion. And remember, because we are using a mapping node, we do have control over the scale, so we can still scale things left and right. Now remember, we're only scaling the vector for this guy. We're not scaling this. So this noise is not moving right now, only our main noise, which is the Musgrave on the right. You could totally wrap this around a sphere and make a beautiful gas giant. Look at that, very nice for planet textures right there. I love it. Well, that's it for this video. Kind of an entry-level tutorial for noise textures. Now, like I said earlier, if you want to see more of this, maybe I'll make a part 2, which will be about the noise patterns, like the shapes and the repeating textures and patterns that can be created with a Voronoi texture. That one is very versatile and flexible for patterns. Let me know in the comments down below right now what you guys would like to see more of. And I'm sure in time I'll learn even more tricks with noise textures, and maybe I'll make a part 2 or 3 showing some more advanced noise textures and how to use them. Well, thanks for watching. Have a great week and happy blending.